And apart from that, we have custom binding. So why is custom binding required? Custom binding is nothing but a binding which is built on top of um, all the other available binding, maybe on top of basic HTTP binding, or maybe on top of WSHTTP binding, or on top of NetTCP binding. Say, why do you need a custom binding? That totally depends on your requirement. Say you have a you have a WCF service, and you have a request and response which say spans from 2 MB to 8 MB, or say 15 MB. So in that case, if you pass this much huge data to and from WCF service, that it is going to affect your performance, and no business will accept a performance concern with the application. So in that case, what you can do is you can either use any of the available bindings. On top of that, you can apply, say, a GCP encoding algorithm to make sure that the data which you are sending to and from a WCF service is encoded or decoded accordingly using the GCP algorithm, and the size gets reduced and the performance is not impacted, or say performance is improved. So that's a kind of scenario where you'll go for that's an example for a scenario where you'll go for a custom binding. And then you have contracts. Contracts, basically you have service contracts, operation contract, data contracts, and fault contracts. So a contract is nothing but you know it's going to be the building block of WCF service. So everything which is exposed from a service, or everything which is passed to and from a service, should be a contract. So that's what a contract basically is. It's a building block of a WCF service. So first of all, service contract. So service contract is uh, is going to be an interface which defines what what all a WCF service is going to expose to its client. Say, for example, I'm having a service called employee service. So from here onwards, whenever I in all the tutorials, I'm planning to take an employee service as the baseline for the WCF service. So if I select an employee service, that the purpose of the employee service is to serve all the client applications with details of an employee, or maybe operations related to an employee. So obviously I'll have to have a method called getEmployee, which will accept an employee ID and will return the details of that employee, and then operations like uh, employee, add employee, edit employee, delete employee, things like that. So all these methods, an interface which defines all these methods which I expose to a client, is called a service contract. Right. So how will a service contract look like? Say, maybe you can say, if you so for whoever has worked with web service, say you download a proxy, you'll get a proxy class which has a namespace, and inside that namespace you will have set of methods which you can access, right? So that particular class, or a structure of that class, is what you call a service contract. Then we have operation contract. So operation contract is nothing but, as I just said, you have a method called getEmployee, or you have a method called addEmployee, you have a method called editEmployee, you have a method called deleteEmployee. So these methods which are exposed, each of the method is called an operation contract, whereas a service contract is going to be a group of these methods, right? So each of these methods exposed to a client is called an operation contract. And then we have data contract. Data contract, again, in the same context, you have an employee service. I said have a method called getEmployee, wherein you pass a employee ID, and then in return get a class employee which has all the details like ID, employee ID, name, age, date of birth, etc., etc. So that particular class which is returned by an operation contract is called a data contract. So data contract is a class which uh, you know represents a particular data is which you pass to and from a WCF service. That's what you call a data contract. And then you have fault contract. Fault contract will go through that during exception handling, but just to touch upon that, fault contract is nothing but exceptions being passed or being thrown from a WCF service. So why do you need a contract for throwing an exception? You can pass an exception itself. The problem is an exception by itself is not a serializable object. So from a WCF perspective, everything should be serializable so that you can pass an XML based data back to the client. So your exception should be serializable, and when you hear that, people who worked with a web service will surely identify it with the SOAP exception. But for a WCF service, whatever it passes to and from should be a contract, and hence we use fault contracts instead of SOAP exceptions. And moreover, here it's just not so bright. It could communicate through NetTCP and everything. So hence we have fault contracts. So fault contracts are nothing but exceptions made on top of application exceptions. Serializable exception made on top of application exception. That's what fault contract is. We'll see it much more about this when we are going through exception handling in WCF. Now we have the next basic concept is going to be endpoint. So what is an endpoint? An endpoint is it consists of a lot of elements, a lot of configuration elements. So endpoint is the configuration which basically tells the client how to access a WCF service. So it consists of a lot of elements, but the basic and most important elements are going to be address, then binding and contract. An address, as I said, is going to be a URL, and a binding is nothing but going to be a protocol, and then a contract is going to be a service contract which this endpoint is going to provide. So if you want to form a sentence out of this, you can say an endpoint says address where to get this particular service. A binding, if you are using this particular address, you should use this particular binding, and then if you use this particular address and if you use this particular binding, if you are going to get this particular contract, this particular service contract. So basically it's going to be where, how and what. That's what an endpoint suggests. So as if you remember, we said like WCF allows it supports multiple protocol, it can be hosted in multiple environments, etc., etc. So this is exactly how you need to configure to allow your WCF service to support multiple protocol. So if you are using, say, basic HTTP bind, if you want your service to support basic HTTP binding, to support WSHTTP, and to support NetTCP, and to support custom binding, so basically you have 4 bindings. So which means you will have 4 endpoints all having the same service contract, right? The service is going to be same. It's just that the protocol is going to be different. So what you'll have to do is you'll have to define 4 endpoints, which has every endpoint should have a unique combination of address and binding, right? So each address will support a unique binding, and so basically you will have 4 endpoint which has a unique combination of address plus binding. And with that, we'll move on to behavior, which we'll see later. I don't have much things to explain now. And then we have channels. So if there are somebody who worked with remoting, I'm sure you'll identify with channels. The moment you hear channels, you'll just realize, oh, remoting. So but here again, the channel is nothing but a communication path created by a proxy. Whenever you call a service from a client, you'll instantiate a proxy, right? And then once you instantiate your proxy, you're actually creating a channel between the client and the server, so that from there onwards the communication happens through that channel. So in remoting, you actually had to create this particular channel and work accordingly. But whereas in WCF service, channels are basically a very important thing, but neither the client nor the the development team who develops the client or the server does not have to know much about the channel unless you are going for custom binding. So if you're going for custom binding, maybe you'll have to learn a little bit on that. But otherwise, the channels, the creation, and uh, things like that, creation, destruction, everything is taken care of by the the, the framework itself. And finally, we have metadata. Metadata is nothing but a proxy. So if you use WSUtil, or if you use add service reference, basically the result you get is a proxy. Uh, a proxy will be more like a schema of the classes, or rather the data contracts which you need to use to communicate with the WCF service. Second thing, the service contract, uh, the proxy basically looks more like a service contract. So it has the data contracts, then it has the operation contracts, or the methods exposed to the client, so that the client can use the methods to access the web service. So a metadata is nothing but a proxy which has all the details which the client can use to access a web service, sorry, a WCF service. So with that, uh, we are coming to the end of this particular session. So the next session, I'll try to have a hands-on, uh, like creating a WCF service, hosting a WCF service, and consuming a WCF service. So I'll try to cover that in the next tutorial, and then the remaining things in in a video tutorial, one or two tutorials which will come later. And with that, we're ending this particular session. So my name is Anup, and my email is anupvr@gmail.com. So in case when you are following this video tutorial, if you go through, if you get stuck somewhere, or if you get some doubts, feel free to contact me. I'll be more than happy to help. Happy learning, and bye for now.